Which tea has the most caffeine? This is a question that people often ask us, and there are actually a few different answers. Depending on what you consider a tea and how you prepare the teas, different types of teas could be considered as having the highest caffeine content. In this video, we're going to tackle the question of which tea has the most caffeine and rank the teas in order of their caffeine content. Before we get started, it would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and like this video to see more like it in the future. If you would prefer to read about this topic, we have a great blog article on our website, neoteas.com. We'll put the link in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. Which tea has the most caffeine? Number 1. Mate and guayusa. 1 cup of yerba mate can contain 180 milligrams of caffeine, while guayusa can have even more. This has to do a lot with the preparation, as the drink is typically prepared with an extremely high leaf-to-water ratio. First, you fill up a gourd 2/3 of the way with leaves and then pour hot water in. The drink can then be enjoyed with a bombilla or metal straw that filters out the leaves automatically. While these herbal infusions do have the most caffeine, they are technically disqualified from the question which tea has the most caffeine because they are not truly tea types. If you're simply looking for a high caffeine drink that's not coffee, this is a good option. Number 2, matcha. To answer the question which tea has the most caffeine, the answer would technically be matcha. Premium matcha is one of the highest caffeine teas you can find. Rather than being infused like a normal leaf tea, matcha powder is mixed directly into water. This means that you can increase the caffeine content simply by adding more powder into the water. A regular serving of matcha will include 2 grams of powder and 136 milligrams of caffeine. If you are preparing koicha or thick matcha, you would use less water and 4 grams of matcha powder. This creates a matcha paste that has 270 milligrams of caffeine. The koicha matcha is consumed during special tea ceremonies and should only be made out of the smoothest matcha powder. If you'd like to make your own koicha, we recommend you use the matcha washimine or the Nakai Superior matcha to avoid the bitterness. Number 3, green teas. When you ask the question which tea has the most caffeine, it is tempting to say green tea, particularly Japanese green tea. This tea type encompasses a lot of the highest caffeine teas in the world, but not all green teas have a high caffeine content. In this section, we will be highlighting a few of our favorite high caffeine green teas and talking a little bit about each one. The first tea on our list is Gyokuro, the only Japanese green tea that really has more caffeine than a cup of coffee. When people ask the question which tea has the most caffeine, Gyokuro is always the top of mind. This is considered to be the most premium Japanese leaf tea because of the careful production process. This tea has been shaded for 3 weeks or more prior to the harvest in order to develop this characteristic sweet and savory flavor. When the theanine in the tea plant is exposed to sunlight, it is converted into catechins. These catechins will have a slightly drier, more bitter flavor than the theanine, so if you're looking for a sweet and savory tea, you will want to go for a shaded sencha or a gyokuro. Other than matcha, gyokuro has the longest shading process. This allows the tea to develop its unique flavor and also its high caffeine content. When the tea plant is cut off from sunlight, it begins to produce more caffeine as a defense mechanism to avoid insects. A cup of premium gyokuro can contain anywhere between 120 to 140 milligrams of caffeine, which is more than most small cups of coffee. You may not feel like it has quite as much caffeine because instead of this sudden jolt of energy, you will get a longer lasting boost that should last you throughout the day. This is good for long periods of work, study, or even meditation. Kabuse Sencha. The second high caffeine tea on the list is Kabuse Sencha. After Gyokuro, Kabuse Sencha is considered to be the second highest quality leaf tea in Japan. These teas are shaded between 10 to 20 days before the harvest to develop a sweeter and smoother flavor with less bitterness. While not shaded as long as Gyokuro and matcha, these teas still develop plenty of caffeine and theanine. These green teas will have more caffeine than a regular Sencha, but less caffeine than a Gyokuro. We find the flavor profile of this tea is lighter and sweeter, without being too strong on these savory or brothy notes. If you like sweeter teas, but are a bit turned off by this more seaweedy flavor of Gyokuro, this may be a perfect tea for you. Sencha. The third tea on our green tea list is Sencha. Sencha is the most common type of green tea in Japan, and it also spans the widest spectrum of flavors. You can have a drier, unshaded asamushi sencha, or you can have a sweeter and fruitier shaded fukomushi sencha. The major factors that influence the flavor of a sencha is what cultivar it comes from, how it's shaded, how it's picked, and how it's steamed. Gyokuro is shaded for 21 days or more prior to the harvest. Kabusecha is shaded for between 10 and 20 days prior to the harvest, but a normal sencha could be unshaded or shaded for up to 10 days before it's picked. The longer it's shaded, generally the more sweetness the tea will have. Also, a farmer can change the flavor profile of a sencha based on how long they steam the tea leaves. Normal sencha teas can be steamed for between 30 and 40 seconds, but fukomushi sencha can be steamed for an additional few seconds to break down the leaves and cause them to produce a richer, fruitier flavor and a deeper green color. You can also have a short steamed or asamushi sencha that is steamed for less than 30 seconds. Most sencha teas will fall somewhere in the neighborhood of half the caffeine as a cup of coffee, so if you're sensitive to caffeine, these might be a good choice for you. Sencha is a good way to get a little bit of caffeine in the morning without being overwhelmed. Shincha. Finally, we get to the fourth tea on our green tea list, Shincha. While Shincha is really a type of Sencha, it refers specifically to the first harvest of the springtime. And sometimes people wait around all year in anticipation of the new harvest. These teas will be on a similar caffeine level to Sencha, but because they are always going to be made from the top sprouts of the tea plant, they will tend to have more caffeine than a typical Sencha tea, all else being equal. That's because these younger, more tender buds produce more caffeine. The tea plant uses caffeine as its primary defense to ward off insects, and because the younger leaves are more vulnerable, they need to produce more. The stems and older leaves of the tea plant are much tougher, and therefore they don't need as much protection. That's why a tea like Bancha, made from the older leaves and stems of the tea plant, it's much lower in caffeine. Back to the main list, and coming at number 4 is white tea. The name white tea comes from the silver buds of the tea plant that are often used to make white tea blends. White tea is not simply a tea made from buds, but rather a solar withered tea that has minimal processing. Some of the more famous white teas are just made from the buds, so they will be higher in caffeine compared to a typical black tea or oolong. The tea leaves are picked and dried out in the sun to slow the oxidation process. A white tea made with just the older, more mature leaves will be lower in caffeine, and the tea made from just the white buds will be a high caffeine tea. Number 5, oolong tea. Oolong teas tend to be made from the older leaves of the tea plant, making it one of the lower caffeine tea types. Oolong is perhaps the most processed of the tea types, so it is possible to use older leaves and still end up with a smooth, flavorful tea. These older tea leaves contain less caffeine, which makes oolong not a correct answer to the question, which tea has the most caffeine. Number 6, we have black tea. When you ask most people which tea has the most caffeine, a lot of them will say black tea, but this is actually not the case. Black teas are fully oxidized, meaning that after they are picked, they are allowed to oxidize naturally. During this oxidation process, the enzymes convert the catechins into theaflavins and theorubicins. Black tea has a broad range in terms of caffeine content, but the caffeine tends to be much lower when compared to some of the heavy-hitting green teas we mentioned earlier on our list. A black tea made from the buds of the tea plant like Jinjin Mei can be quite high in caffeine, whereas a black tea made from the older leaves will have a significantly lower caffeine content. Number 7, Puerh or Heicha. Dark teas or post-fermented teas are what most people think of when you ask them the question which tea has the most caffeine, but this is also incorrect. Dark tea can actually have some of the lowest caffeine content in the world of tea. Dark teas tend to be made from the older tea leaves, and they can be fermented for years or even decades after packaging. During the post-fermentation process, the caffeine in the tea leaf is broken down, meaning that the tea aged for the longest time will be the lowest in caffeine, and the tea aged for the shortest time will be the highest caffeine tea in terms of Heicha. Number 8, herbal teas like chamomile, ginger, and peppermint. Of course, you can't get much lower in caffeine than caffeine-free. This is what you get when you drink herbal infusions like chamomile, ginger, and peppermint. These are technically not considered teas because they don't come from the tea plant, Camellia sinensis, but we thought we'd include them on the list anyway to give you a caffeine-free alternative. These drinks are a good way to enjoy a warm, healthy, and flavorful beverage in the evening time without consuming additional caffeine. Most of these herbal infusions or tisanes are caffeine-free, so feel free to drink away. Can you reduce the caffeine in tea? There are a few different ways to reduce the caffeine content of your tea. One method is to give the first brewing of the tea to a friend and simply enjoy the second brewing of the tea. Most of the caffeine will end up in the first brewing of the tea, and the second brewing can sometimes even have more flavor. Another way to reduce the caffeine content of green tea is by cold brewing it. Caffeine is pretty hard to extract, so to get all of it out of the leaves, you need a higher temperature and a longer brewing time. By using cooler water, you can extract a fraction of the total caffeine in the leaves and still enjoy a delicious and refreshing cold brewed tea. We hope you have found this guide helpful when it comes to picking out a high caffeine green tea. If you'd like to try any of these teas like Gyokuro and Matcha, you can find all of them on our website. When you order tea from us, you're helping to support our mission of providing premium, organically grown Japanese green tea to people all around the world. We work with a few talented farmers in Japan, and after trying hundreds of different green teas, we've settled on these ones as being the best tasting. You're free to try whichever ones you'd like, or you can try a sampler and try a bunch of different ones at once. We would also really appreciate it if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to see more like it in the future. If you have any questions about green tea or tea in general, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.